So it goes back to what you were saying in the beginning. People are too worried about what their own community will think of them.
Yeah.
And because they don't want to face a backlash, they're scared to do anything or do anything differently. Even if they have done their research into it and think, this is a good path for me to take, they'll be too worried.
I think in my experience, I've seen that often the people who are the most vocal critics of people in their own culture doing something slightly different generally are just trying to affirm to themselves how good a Sikh or a Hindu they are. And, that speaks to me of some insecurity. They need to do that to prove to themselves how good they are in relation to anyone else. And I suppose that's just a result of, like you said, being brought up in that faith. Things are the way they've always been.
Yeah.
And so you don't really know the underlying truths behind it necessarily.
Yeah.
And so you go around waving your superficial banner around saying, I'm a Sikh because I've got this, that, and the other.
That's right,
Whereas missing out the main point.
That's right,
I think it's the same for any religion.
I think so, yeah.
Because I was just going to say, the 50% of people who, criticised you for going on the show, they probably weren't perfect themselves.
That's right, yeah. And I think people I think have a tendency to, when you see someone and you don't know them, maybe you see it on Twitter so much, people just assume other people to be a certain way, or just because they don't fit, because everyone I think carries like a model or a template about what someone should be like.
Okay, Paramji, if I can just interrupt for a moment. I think we have a caller who's online.
Sure.
Hello there, good afternoon. Welcome to A Reasonable Conversation. Who's calling?
Hello, it's Durganand here.
Durganandji, good afternoon. I recognised your voice immediately. A pleasure to hear you.
Yes.
And
it's about all man-made religions are intolerant. What happens when one person comes, he says only his God is true and your God is false.
That's a wonderful observation.
He says his way of life, his God is true, your gods are bad. Well, that's what the conflict is about.
That's a wonderful observation. No, thank you so much for that. Man-made interpretations tend to be the ones which are intolerant.
Yeah.
That's wonderful.
What is intolerant is because of this thing, that my God is superior, your God is inferior.
Thank you so much for that, Durganandji.
Thank you for your call.
An excellent contribution, as always, and a pleasure to hear from you again.
Yeah.
So you were just saying that... Durganandji has just been saying that man-made interpretations tend to be the cause of problems. And it's funny, just on that point, we've always mentioned that there are always mystics in religions who seem to have some experience, and they're always followed by miscreants, people who come along and then decide to use that person's speeches, talks, sharing for their own purposes.
Yeah.
And I think maybe the intolerance creeps in at that point when ignorant people get involved with the teachings of some of our masters.
Yeah. I think it's probably fair to say that all religions have had this, where you've got teachings of different spiritual masters have come along and taught the truth, but then ultimately, depending on how wise the disciples are and of understanding what that person was trying to say, that message gets
it gets distorted for some public or personal agenda.
Exactly, all those things start coming into play, and then suddenly you've got 200 years down the line, 1,000 years down the line, you got something that's actually very different, and you've got then more teachers that have to come to clarify. Actually, this is what the original guy meant, and this is what I'm saying as well.
And it's such a shame, because the message of that guru is lost because people are so fixated on making it something that it's not. They forget what the guru was trying to teach them in the first place.
Right. Yeah, it's
which is such a shame.
Yeah,
it's always easier to worship someone, put someone on a pedestal, than to try to follow what they actually did themselves.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the issue comes. It's more comfortable to have a holy leader and just pray to him rather than put that effort in yourself and start fixing yourself.
Give up all the foods that you think are so delicious and go and sit under a tree for years on end and do breathing practices and everything else. It's tough.
It is tough. Yeah, I'd probably prefer gulab jamun myself.
I was at a function not so long ago, and there was a gathering of international religious leaders.
Oh right.
And there were school children there as well. And just for a moment I had a glimpse of what the school children were seeing, and they were seeing a group of religious leaders all wearing different big hats. Because everybody had these huge hats, and the mufti had a different sort of a hat, and the Hindu priest had a very colourful turban and everything. And it was just a collection of different hats. It just struck me as being so strange.
And so before the break we were talking about how different gurus had a message which was lost because people start worshipping the guru and following the guru rather than the message, which I think is quite true for a lot of Indians. We kind of get lost and mesmerised by the guru.
Actually, it's really, on that, it's so apt. It's really strange, isn't it, that Guru Nanak wasn't a Sikh, Buddha wasn't a Buddhist, Christ wasn't a Christian, because none of those existed at the time. Muhammad wasn't a Muslim, because none of those existed. And it's as though the religions and the churches are created by people who came after them. I remember reading somewhere that Buddha actually left instructions that nobody should ever make a statue in his likeness.
Oh, wow.
And it was 200 years before somebody created a carved image of what the Buddha looked like, because he knew people would start worshipping me and not my message and my teaching. And this is a common refrain, isn't it? The most devout religious people tend to adhere to the religion and maybe not so much to the teachings.
That's what Durga Das was saying.
Durganand
exactly,
was saying,
Durga and man-made religions.
I think maybe it's also to do with when you have a spiritual teacher who comes and teaches something that resonates with a lot of people, they are so admired. I think Asian society is one where, if you say something that's really good, you have so much, you automatically get so much respect, and maybe it's true of like all people, and so it's a kind of maybe a natural human phenomenon where you just kind of gravitate towards, you're just in awe, you just automatically become in awe. You think, wow, what you're saying is really good.
You have to see Life of Brian. There's a scene in it where John Cleese is talking to somebody who wants to be a prophet, and the prophet is saying, I'm not a prophet, and John Cleese says, I should know, I've made a few. And so you're right, people rush to worship something possibly which resonates with them and touches them somewhere deeply.
That's right.
I think Param made a point earlier. He touched on something about peculiar to the South Asian culture, though. I mean, in that, we all like our Swamijis and our gurus and our mystics, but when it comes to, I've seen this in my own life, when it comes to actually potentially going to follow one or starting to become a serious yoga practitioner, then the Auntie network starts buzzing with, is that allowed? Is that okay? you shouldn't be doing that, Make him a doctor,
we definitely want another Vivekanand, but kisi aur ke ghar mein ho.
That's right,
We've just had a text in from Sunil. He said, humans do not tolerate anyone that is different to them, whether it's belief or appearance. So maybe it's something that's ingrained in human beings, that if someone's different to us, we're automatically going to have our barriers up and be intolerant of that person.
Yeah, I think it's a fair point. I remember when I was in Chicago about sort of 7-8 years ago, that the amount of people that sort of came up to me, just like Chicagoans, local Chicago people, and they just had so many questions to ask me, like about, because they assumed I was of a Middle Eastern, or they just make so many assumptions, just because what they're seeing is so beyond their definition of normal or sort of standard.
Yeah.
And I think there's just a kind of a knee-jerk fear reaction. They weren't rude though; they were just asking loads of questions. But the amount of questions was almost like I could have my own radio station, broadcast from like.
So they were asking reasonable questions.
Yeah, they were asking reasonable questions.
So could it be something to do with when people gather, they automatically adhere to a herd mentality, but when they're on their own, they feel comfortably enough to explore things reasonably without being so worried about what other people think.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point, actually.
Actually, it just reminded me, I hosted a conference once in Tel Aviv, and we had people from all over the world for this conference, and it was an IT sort of thing, and afterwards we went for a bite to eat in Jerusalem, and around this dining table there were a few devout Orthodox Jews who I was working with a company at that time, and we had Southern Baptists from Georgia in the States, we had some Buddhists who'd come from Japan, and so around this dining table, sitting there, having eaten, you know what happens? We had this brief moment where everybody was saying, well, actually, we're all quite similar. Hang on a minute. And they were all talking about some of the cores of their beliefs and their religions, which were all exactly the same. And, I was sitting there quietly at one end, and the finance officer, a Jewish chap, he said to me, Satish, you're really quiet. What does Hinduism have to say about this? And I said, well, you've all declared yourselves to be Hindus as far as I'm concerned. And it's true. It's that openness and that tolerance which... we need to perhaps be open to a lot more.
We've just got a caller on the line. I think it's Amit.
Amit, welcome to A Reasonable Conversation. And what do you have to share with us about religious intolerance?
Thank you. I was just wanting to touch base on the actual religious intolerant subject, and specifically say it has been, I'm sure that you've been noticing as well, that it has been increasing in this specific country for the last few years.
Definitely.
And I think the underlying principle which is disregarded is that the fact that people are equal, regardless of race, colour, religion, and stuff like that. Personally, it just shows a lack of education in the public's understanding towards religion, etc. It's taken certain events such as like 7/11, things like that, to highlight to the public what the difference between a Muslim wearing a turban is and a Sikh wearing a turban is after the sniper attacks, etc. So it just shows that people shouldn't just be educated in school, but throughout their lives.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
I feel like, for instance, you and I wouldn't be able to remember Pythagoras' maths equation 10 years after school.
Do you want to bet? That was a sweeping statement to make, and I think it was totally intolerant of those of us who loved mathematics.
What's A squared plus B squared, my friend?
Well, the way I was taught it was the score on the hippopotamus is equal to the weight of the scores on the two sides of the banks, or something like that. But you're absolutely right. I totally agree. Oh, but thank you for that, Amit. Yeah, I do totally agree.
It's not only that, I think political philosophy has a big part to play in the whole situation. I mean, there's fears about the national security that needs to be examined.
Well, political motivation is something that is very, very relevant, because I think your spiritual beliefs, they connect with people at a very deep level, and politicians are always looking for ways to motivate and manipulate people to gather support. Amity, thank you for introducing that point to us, and I'm just going to introduce another point to our guest Paramji today, which has also become quite current, and that point is to do with the 1984 problems and suddenly the recent news about British involvement. So I'm going to move on to that. Thanks very much for guiding us to that point, Amitji. So we've had these revelations that there was a hand of perhaps the clandestine services in this country in what happened in 1984.
Yeah.
Have you come across any more news about that?
Yeah, so it's 1984 is it's a very emotive subject for
It is.
a lot of people, for Punjabis in particular, and it's interesting to see that there's been revelations made, with the new revelations with the potential involvement of like the British government with regards to the planning of 1984. But it's such an emotive subject that it becomes be able to actually. There's so many rumours and around this subject that it makes it very difficult to have reasonable conversations with people, because people just automatically assume, oh no, there was, the facts are, no one really knows the facts.
That's right.
One group, you have the Sikh community that say, well, this is what happened, and this, there was X, Y, and Z facts, and then you have the sort of Indian government sort of piece of facts, which is well, the facts were like this and this is why we did that, and really there's not really been any kind of solid reconciliation.
I think I agree. The detail has yet to come out, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But I think reconciliation is such an important thing, because one thing that we know without a doubt, and that is that the Congress government at the time used the whole situation, and they were probably at the root of creating the whole problem, and then deflected it onto two religious communities. And the two religious communities moved further apart, and yet they used to be the closest, brothers and sisters they were, and yet that rift that occurred, and political people, I think, possibly took advantage, and for their own purposes and reasons.
Absolutely.
And then and we're still dealing with the aftermath of that, aren't we?
Absolutely. It's the saddest thing. It breaks my heart that the Hindu and Sikh community, even to this day, we at the City Sikhs Network, we made it a point to do a lot of work with, as much work as we can with different communities, and especially the Hindu community.
That's brilliant.
Yeah, and because our communities are so similar culturally, we share the same culture, we share the same food, the same clothing, the same music. India is a vast, but I mean culturally, it's the dals and the classical Indian music, and we share so much culture.
And even about spirituality and yoga
absolutely
comes from, you know, we both share that too.
Absolutely.
So it's important to look at what makes us so similar instead of focusing on what makes us so different. And that's also playing up to the political manipulation of
It's surprising
driving.
that there's